The Iran-Contra affair, Persian, Spanish, caso Irán-Contra, also referred to as Irangate, Contragate, or the Iran-Contra scandal, was a political scandal in the United States that occurred during the second term of the Reagan administration. Senior administration officials secretly facilitated the sale of arms to Iran, which was the subject of an arms embargo. They hoped, thereby, to fund the Contras in Nicaragua while at the same time negotiating the release of several U.S. hostages. Under the Boland Amendment, further funding of the Contras by the government had been prohibited by Congress. The scandal began as an operation to free 7 American hostages being held in Lebanon by Hezbollah, a paramilitary group with Iranian ties connected to the Army of the Guardians of the Islamic Revolution. It was planned that Israel would ship weapons to Iran, and then the United States would resupply Israel and receive the Israeli payment. The Iranian recipients promised to do everything in their power to achieve the release of the hostages. Large modifications to the plan were devised by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the National Security Council in late 1985, in which a portion of the proceeds from the weapon sales was diverted to fund anti-Sandinista fighters, known as Contras, against the socialist government of Nicaragua. While President Ronald Reagan was a supporter of the Contra cause, the evidence is disputed as to whether he authorized the diversion of the money to the Contras, raised by the arms sales. Handwritten notes taken by Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger on December 7, 1985, indicate that Reagan was aware of potential hostage transfers with Iran, as well as the sale of Hawk and TOW missiles to moderate elements within that country. Weinberger wrote that Reagan said he could answer to charges of illegality but couldn't answer to the charge that big strong President Reagan passed up a chance to free the hostages. After the weapon sales were revealed in November 1986, Reagan appeared on national television and stated that the weapons transfers had indeed occurred, but that the United States did not trade arms for hostages. The investigation was impeded when large volumes of documents relating to the scandal were destroyed or withheld from investigators by Reagan administration officials. On March 4, 1987, Reagan returned to the airwaves in a nationally televised address, taking full responsibility, and saying that what began as a strategic opening to Iran deteriorated, in its implementation, into trading arms for hostages. Several investigations ensued, including by the U.S. Congress and the 3-person, Reagan-appointed Tower Commission. Neither found any evidence that President Reagan himself knew of the extent of the multiple programs. Ultimately, the sale of weapons to Iran was not deemed a criminal offense, but charges were brought against 5 individuals for their support of the Contras. Those charges, however, were later dropped because the administration refused to declassify certain documents. The indicted conspirators faced various lesser charges instead. In the end, 14 administration officials were indicted, including then Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. 11 convictions resulted, some of which were vacated on appeal. The rest of those indicted or convicted were all pardoned in the final days of the presidency of George H. W. Bush, who had been vice president at the time of the affair. The Iran-Contra affair and the ensuing deception to protect senior administration officials including President Reagan has been cast as an example of post-truth politics. Background. Under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the United States was the largest seller of arms to Iran, and the vast majority of the weapons that the Islamic Republic of Iran inherited in January 1979 were American-made. To maintain this arsenal, Iran required a steady supply of spare parts to replace those broken and worn out. After Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran in November 1979 and took 52 Americans hostage, U.S. President Jimmy Carter imposed an arms embargo on Iran. After Iraq invaded Iran in September 1980, Iran desperately needed weapons and spare parts for its current weapons. After Ronald Reagan took office as president on January 20, 1981, he vowed to continue Carter's policy of blocking arms sales to Iran on the grounds that Iran supported terrorism. A group of senior Reagan administration officials in the Senior Interdepartmental Group conducted a secret study on July 21, 1981, and concluded that the arms embargo was ineffective because Iran could always buy arms and spare parts for its American weapons elsewhere, while at the same time the arms embargo opened the door for Iran to fall into the Soviet sphere of influence, as the Kremlin could sell Iran weapons if the United States would not. The conclusion was that the United States should start selling Iran arms as soon as it was politically possible to keep Iran from falling into the Soviet sphere of influence. At the same time, the openly declared goal of Ayatollah Khomeini to export his Islamic revolution all over the Middle East and overthrow the governments of Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the other Persian Gulf states led to the Americans perceiving Khomeini as a major threat to the United States. In the spring of 1983, the United States launched Operation Staunch, a wide-ranging diplomatic effort to persuade other nations all over the world not to sell arms or spare parts for weapons to Iran. At least part of the reason why the Irán-Contra affair proved so humiliating for the United States when the story first broke in November 1986 that the U.S. was selling arms to Iran was that American diplomats, as part of Operation Staunch, had, from the spring of 1983 on, been lecturing other nations about how morally wrong it was to sell arms to the Islamic Republic of Iran and applying strong pressure to prevent these arms sales to Iran. At the same time that the American government was considering their options on selling arms to Iran, Contra militants based in Honduras were waging a guerrilla war to topple the Sandinista National Liberation Front, FSLN, revolutionary government of Nicaragua. Almost from the time he took office in 1981, a major goal of the Reagan administration was the overthrow of the left-wing Sandinista government in Nicaragua and to support the Contra rebels. The Reagan administration's policy towards Nicaragua produced a major clash between the executive and legislative arms as Congress sought to limit, if not curb altogether, the ability of the White House to support the Contras. Direct U.S. funding of the Contras insurgency was made illegal through the Boland Amendment, the name given to 3 U.S. legislative amendments between 1982 and 1984 aimed at limiting U.S. government assistance to Contra militants. Funding ran out for the Contras by July 1984, and in October a total ban was placed in effect. The second Boland Amendment, in effect from October 3, 1984 to December 3, 1985, stated, "During the fiscal year 1985 no funds available to the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense or any other agency or entity of the United States involved in intelligence activities may be obligated or expended for the purpose of or which may have the effect of supporting directly or indirectly military or paramilitary operations in Nicaragua by any nation, organization, group, movement, or individual." In violation of the Boland Amendment, senior officials of the Reagan administration continued to secretly arm and train the Contras and provide arms to Iran, an operation they called the Enterprise. As the Contras were heavily dependent upon U.S. military and financial support, the second Boland Amendment threatened to break the Contra movement and led to President Reagan in 1984 to order the National Security Council, NSC, to keep the Contras together body and soul, no matter what Congress voted for. A major legal debate at the center of the Iran-Contra affair concerned the question of whether the NSC was one of the any other agency or entity of the United States involved in intelligence activities covered by the Boland Amendment. The Reagan administration argued it was not, and many in Congress argued that it was. The majority of constitutional scholars have asserted the NSC did indeed fall within the purview of the Second Boland Amendment, though the amendment did not mention the NSC by name. The broader constitutional question at stake was the power of Congress versus the power of the presidency. The Reagan administration argued that because the Constitution assigned the right to conduct foreign policy to the executive, its efforts to overthrow the government of Nicaragua were a presidential prerogative that Congress had no right to try to halt via the Boland Amendments. By contrast, congressional leaders argued that the Constitution had assigned Congress control of the budget, and Congress had every right to use that power not to fund projects like attempting to overthrow the government of Nicaragua that they disapproved of. As part of the effort to circumvent the Boland Amendment, the NSC established the Enterprise, an arms smuggling network headed by a retired U.S. Air Force officer turned arms dealer Richard Secord that supplied arms to the Contras. It was ostensibly a private sector operation, but in fact was controlled by the NSC. To fund the enterprise, the Reagan administration was constantly on the lookout for funds that came from outside the U.S. government in order not to explicitly violate the letter of the Boland Amendment, though the efforts to find alternative funding for the Contras violated the spirit of the Boland Amendment. Ironically, military aid to the Contras was reinstated with congressional consent in October 1986, a month before the scandal broke. Arms sales to Iran. On June 17, 1985, National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane wrote a National Security Decision Directive which called for the United States to begin a rapprochement with the Islamic Republic of Iran. The paper read: Dynamic political evolution is taking place inside Iran. Instability caused by the pressures of the Iraq-Iran war, economic deterioration, and regime infighting create the potential for major changes inside Iran. The Soviet Union is better positioned than the US to exploit and benefit from any power struggle that results in changes from the Iranian regime. The US should encourage Western allies and friends to help Iran meet its import requirements so as to reduce the attractiveness of Soviet assistance. This includes provision of selected military equipment. Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger was highly negative, writing on his copy of McFarlane's paper, "This is almost too absurd to comment on, like asking Gaddafi to Washington for a cozy chat." Secretary of State George Shultz was also opposed, stating that having designated Iran a state sponsor of terrorism in January 1984, how could the United States possibly sell arms to Iran? Only the director of the Central Intelligence Agency William Casey supported McFarlane's plan to start selling arms to Iran. In early July 1985, the historian Michael Ledeen, a consultant of National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, requested assistance from Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres for help in the sale of arms to Iran. Having talked to an Israeli diplomat David Kickmish and Leiden, McFarlane learned that the Iranians were prepared to have Hezbollah release American hostages in Lebanon in exchange for Israelis shipping Iran American weapons. Having been designated a state sponsor of terrorism since January 1984, Iran was in the midst of the Iran-Iraq War and could find few Western nations willing to supply it with weapons. The idea behind the plan was for Israel to ship weapons through an intermediary, identified as Manukur Ghorbanifar, to the Islamic Republic as a way of aiding a supposedly moderate, politically influential faction within the regime of Ayatollah Khomeini, who was believed to be seeking a rapprochement with the United States. After the transaction, the United States would reimburse Israel with the same weapons, while receiving monetary benefits. McFarlane in a memo to Shultz and Weinberger wrote, "The short-term dimension concerns the 7 hostages, the long-term dimension involves the establishment of a private dialogue with Iranian officials on the broader relations. They sought specifically the delivery from Israel of 100 TOW missiles." The plan was discussed with President Reagan on July 18, 1985 and again on August 6, 1985. Shultz at the latter meeting warned Reagan that we were just falling into the arms for hostages business and we shouldn't do it. The Americans believed that there was a moderate faction in the Islamic Republic headed by Akbar Hashimi Rafsanjani, the powerful Speaker of the Majlis, who was seen as a leading potential successor to Khomeini and who was alleged to want a rapprochement with the United States. The Americans believed that Rafsanjani had the power to order Hezbollah to free the American hostages, and establishing a relationship with him by selling Iran arms would ultimately place Iran back within the American sphere of influence. It remains unclear if Rafsanjani really wanted a rapprochement with the United States or was just deceiving Reagan administration officials who were willing to believe that he was a moderate who would effect a rapprochement. Rafsanjani, whose nickname is the Shark, was described by the British journalist Patrick Brogan as a man of great charm and formidable intelligence, known for his subtlety and ruthlessness, whose motives in the Iran-Contra affair remain completely mysterious. The Israeli government required that the sale of arms meet high-level approval from the United States government, and when McFarlane convinced them that the U.S. government approved the sale, Israel obliged by agreeing to sell the arms. In 1985, President Reagan entered Bethesda Naval Hospital for colon cancer surgery. While the president was recovering in the hospital, McFarlane met with him and told him that representatives from Israel had contacted the National Security Agency to pass on confidential information from what Reagan later described as the moderate Iranian faction headed by Rafsanjani, opposed to the Ayatollah's hardline anti-American policies. According to Reagan, these Iranians sought to establish a quiet relationship with the United States, before establishing formal relationships upon the death of the aging Ayatollah. In Reagan's account, McFarlane told Reagan that the Iranians, to demonstrate their seriousness, offered to persuade the Hezbollah militants to release the 7 U.S. hostages. McFarlane met with the Israeli intermediaries. Reagan claimed that he allowed this because he believed that establishing relations with a strategically located country, and preventing the Soviet Union from doing the same, was a beneficial move. Although Reagan claims that the arms sales were to a moderate faction of Iranians, the Walsh Iran-Contra report states that the arms sales were to Iran itself, which was under the control of the Ayatollah. Following the Israeli U.S. meeting, Israel requested permission from the United States to sell a small number of BGM-71 TOW anti-tank missiles to Iran, claiming that this would aid the moderate Iranian faction, by demonstrating that the group actually had high-level connections to the U.S. government. Reagan initially rejected the plan, until Israel sent information to the United States showing that the moderate Iranians were opposed to terrorism and had fought against it. Now having a reason to trust the moderates, Reagan approved the transaction, which was meant to be between Israel and the moderates in Iran, with the United States reimbursing Israel. In his 1990 autobiography An American Life, Reagan claimed that he was deeply committed to securing the release of the hostages. It was this compassion that supposedly motivated his support for the arms initiatives. The president requested that the moderate Iranians do everything in their capability to free the hostages held by Hezbollah. Reagan always insisted in public after the scandal broke in late 1986 that purpose behind the arms for hostages trade was to establish a working relationship with the moderate faction associated with Rafsanjani to facilitate the re-establishment of the American-Iranian alliance after the soon-to-be-expected death of Khomeini, to end the Iran-Iraq War and end Iranian support for Islamic terrorism while downplaying the importance of freeing the hostages in Lebanon as a secondary issue. By contrast, when testifying before the Tower Commission, Reagan declared that hostage issue was the main reason for selling arms to Iran. The following arms were supplied to Iran. August 20, 1985 96 TOW anti-tank missiles. September 14, 1985 408 more TOWs. November 24, 1985 18 Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. February 17, 1986 500 TOWs. February 27, 1986 500 TOWs. May 24, 1986 508 TOWs, 240 Hawk spare parts. August 4, 1986 more Hawk spares. October 28, 1986 500 TOWs. First arms sale. On August 20, 1985, Israel sent 96 American-made TOW missiles to Iran through an arms dealer Manuker Ghorbanifar. Subsequently, on September 14, 1985, 408 more TOW missiles were delivered. On September 15, 1985, following the second delivery, Reverend Benjamin Weir was released by his captors, the Islamic Jihad Organization. Modifications in plans. On November 24, 1985, 18 Hawk anti-aircraft missiles were delivered. Robert McFarlane resigned on December 4, 1985, citing that he wanted to spend more time with his family. He was replaced by Admiral John Poindexter. 2 days later, Reagan met with his advisors at the White House, where a new plan was introduced. This one called for a slight change in the arms transactions. Instead of the weapons going to the moderate Iranian group, they would go to moderate Iranian army leaders. As each weapons delivery was made from Israel by air, the hostages held by Hezbollah would be released. Israel would continue to be reimbursed by the United States for the weapons. Though staunchly opposed by Secretary of State George Shultz and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, the plan was authorized by Reagan, who stated that, "We were not trading arms for hostages, nor were we negotiating with terrorists." In his notes of a meeting held in the White House on December 7, 1985, Weinberger wrote he told Reagan that this plan was illegal, writing, "I argued strongly that we have an embargo that makes arms sales to Iran illegal and President couldn't violate it, and that washing transactions through Israel wouldn't make it legal." Shultz, Don Reagan agreed. Weinberger's notes have Reagan saying he could answer charges of illegality, but he couldn't answer charge that big strong President Reagan passed up a chance to free hostages. Now retired National Security Advisor McFarlane flew to London to meet with Israelis and Ghorbanifar in an attempt to persuade the Iranian to use his influence to release the hostages before any arms transactions occurred. This plan was rejected by Ghorbanifar. On the day of McFarlane's resignation, Oliver North, a military aide to the United States National Security Council, NSC, proposed a new plan for selling arms to Iran, which included two major adjustments. Instead of selling arms through Israel, the sale was to be direct, and a portion of the proceeds would go to Contras, or Nicaraguan paramilitary fighters waging guerrilla warfare against the democratically elected Sandinista government, at a markup. The dealings with the Iranians were conducted via the NSC with Admiral Poindexter and his deputy Colonel North, with the American historians Malcolm Byrne and Peter Kornbluh writing that Poindexter granted much power to North, who made the most of the situation, often deciding important matters on his own, striking outlandish deals with the Iranians, and acting in the name of the president on issues that were far beyond his competence. All of these activities continued to take place within the framework of the president's broad authorization. Until the press reported on the existence of the operation, nobody in the administration questioned the authority of Poindexter's and North's team to implement the president's decisions. North proposed a $15 million markup, while contracted arms broker Ghorbanifar added a 41% markup of his own. Other members of the NSC were in favor of North's plan, with large support. Poindexter authorized it without notifying President Reagan, and it went into effect. At first, the Iranians refused to buy the arms at the inflated price because of the excessive markup imposed by North and Ghorbanifar. They eventually relented, and in February 1986, 1,000 TOW missiles were shipped to the country. From May to November 1986, there were additional shipments of miscellaneous weapons and parts. Both the sale of weapons to Iran, and the funding of the Contras, attempted to circumvent not only stated administration policy, but also the Boland Amendment. Administration officials argued that regardless of the Congress restricting the funds for the Contras, or any affair, the President, or in this case the administration, could carry on by seeking alternative means of funding such as private entities and foreign governments. Funding from one foreign country, Brunei, was botched when North's secretary, von Hall, transposed the numbers of North's Swiss bank account number. A Swiss businessman, suddenly $10 million richer, alerted the authorities of the mistake. The money was eventually returned to the Sultan of Brunei, with interest. On January 7, 1986, John Poindexter proposed to the President a modification of the approved plan. Instead of negotiating with the moderate Iranian political group, the United States would negotiate with moderate members of the Iranian government. Poindexter told Reagan that Ghorbanifar had important connections within the Iranian government, so with the hope of the release of the hostages, Reagan approved this plan as well. Throughout February 1986, weapons were shipped directly to Iran by the United States, as part of Oliver North's plan, without the knowledge of President Reagan, and none of the hostages were released. Retired National Security Advisor McFarlane conducted another international voyage, this one to Tehran, bringing with him a gift of a Bible having a handwritten inscription by Ronald Reagan, and, according to George Cave, a cake baked in the shape of a key. Howard Teicher described the cake as a joke between North and Ghorbanifar. He met directly with Iranian officials associated with Rafsanjani that sought to establish U.S. Iranian relations in an attempt to free the 4 remaining hostages. The American delegation comprised McFarlane, North, Cave, a retired CIA agent who worked in Iran in the 1960s-70s, Teicher, an Israeli diplomat Amir Amnir, and a CIA translator arrived in Tehran in an Israeli plane carrying forged Irish passports on May 25, 1986. This meeting also failed. Much to McFarlane's disgust, he did not meet ministers, and instead met, in his words, 3rd and 4th level officials. At one point, an angry McFarlane shouted, "As I am a minister, I expect to meet with decision makers. Otherwise, you can work with my staff." The Iranians requested concessions such as Israel's withdrawal from the Golan Heights, which the United States rejected. More importantly, McFarlane refused to ship spare parts for the Hawk missiles until the Iranians had Hezbollah release the American hostages, whereas the Iranians wanted to reverse that sequence with the spare parts being shipped first before the hostages were freed. The differing negotiating positions led to McFarlane's mission going home after 4 days. After the failure of the secret visit to Tehran, McFarlane advised Reagan not to talk to the Iranians anymore, advice that was disregarded. Subsequent dealings. On July 26, 1986, Hezbollah freed the American hostage Father Lawrence Jenko, former head of Catholic Relief Services in Lebanon. Following this, William Casey, head of the CIA, requested that the United States authorize sending a shipment of small missile parts to Iranian military forces as a way of expressing gratitude. Casey also justified this request by stating that the contact in the Iranian government might otherwise lose face or be executed, and hostages might be killed. Reagan authorized the shipment to ensure that those potential events would not occur. North used this release to persuade Reagan to switch over to a sequential policy of freeing the hostages one by one, instead of the all-or-nothing policy that the Americans had pursued until then. By this point, the Americans had grown tired of Ghorbanifar, who had proven himself a dishonest intermediary who played off both sides to his own commercial advantage. In August 1986, the Americans had established a new contact in the Iranian government, Ali Hashemi Bahremani, the nephew of Rafsanjani and an officer in the Revolutionary Guard. The fact that the Revolutionary Guard was deeply involved in international terrorism seemed only to attract the Americans more to Bahremani, who was seen as someone with the influence to change Iran's policies. Richard Secord, an American arms dealer, who was being used as a contact with Iran, wrote to North, "My judgment is that we have opened up a new and probably better channel into Iran." North was so impressed with Barmani that he arranged for him to secretly visit Washington, D.C. and gave him a guided tour at midnight of the White House. North frequently met with Barmani in the summer and fall of 1986 in West Germany, discussing arms sales to Iran, the freeing of hostages held by Hezbollah and how best to overthrow President Saddam Hussein of Iraq and the establishment of a non-hostile regime in Baghdad. In September and October 1986, 3 more Americans, Frank Reed, Joseph Sicipio, and Edward Tracy, were abducted in Lebanon by a separate terrorist group, who referred to them simply as G.I. Joe, after the popular American toy. The reasons for their abduction are unknown, although it is speculated that they were kidnapped to replace the freed Americans. One more original hostage, David Jacobson, was later released. The captors promised to release the remaining 2, but the release never happened. During a secret meeting in Frankfurt in October 1986, North told Barmani that Saddam Hussein must go. North also claimed that Reagan had told him to tell Barmani that Saddam Hussein is an asshole. Barmani, during a secret meeting in Mainz, informed North that Rafsanjani, for his own politics, decided to get all the groups involved and give them a role to play. Thus, all the factions in the Iranian government would be jointly responsible for the talks with the Americans and there would not be an internal war. This demand of Barmani caused much dismay on the American side, as it made clear to them that they would not be dealing solely with a moderate faction in the Islamic Republic, as the Americans liked to pretend to themselves, but rather with all the factions in the Iranian government, including those who were very much involved in terrorism. Despite this, the talks were not broken off. Discovery and scandal. After a leak by Mehdi Hashimi, a senior official in the Army of the Guardians of the Islamic Revolution, the Lebanese magazine Ash-Shira exposed the arrangement on November 3, 1986. This was the first public report of the weapons for hostages deal. The operation was discovered only after an airlift of guns, Corporate Air Services HPF 821, was downed over Nicaragua. Eugene Hasenfuss, who was captured by Nicaraguan authorities after surviving the plane crash, initially alleged in a press conference on Nicaraguan soil that 2 of his co-workers, Max Gomez and Ramon Medina, worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. He later said he did not know whether they did or not. The Iranian government confirmed the Ash-Shira story, and 10 days after the story was first published, President Reagan appeared on national television from the Oval Office on November 13, stating, "My purpose was to send a signal that the United States was prepared to replace the animosity between with a new relationship. At the same time we undertook this initiative, we made clear that Iran must oppose all forms of international terrorism as a condition of progress in our relationship. The most significant step which Iran could take, we indicated, would be to use its influence in Lebanon to secure the release of all hostages held there." The scandal was compounded when Oliver North destroyed or hid pertinent documents between November 21 and November 25, 1986. During North's trial in 1989, his secretary, Fawn Hall, testified extensively about helping North alter, shred, and remove official United States National Security Council, NSC, documents from the White House. According to the New York Times, enough documents were put into a government shredder to jam it. North's explanation for destroying some documents was to protect the lives of individuals involved in Iran-Contra operations. It was not until 1993, years after the trial, that North's notebooks were made public, and only after the National Security Archive and Public Citizen sued the Office of the Independent Counsel under the Freedom of Information Act. During the trial, North testified that on November.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.